The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would change everything. Frank Morrison had been awake anyway, oil-stained hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, staring at the half-assembled transmission on his workbench. Sleep had become elusive in recent years, another casualty of age and old wounds that ached when storms rolled through the valley. The garage smelled of motor oil and metal shavings, familiar scents that had defined his life for the past 2 decades. When the phone rang, cutting to the silence like a blade, something in his chest tightened. Calls at this hour never brought good news. Frank, the voice was his daughter Sarah's, but it sounded broken, hollow. Dad, they took Emma. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the concrete floor. 20 years of careful construction. The quiet life, the simple routine, the man everyone knew as Old Frank, cracked along with the porcelain. What do you mean they took her? His voice remained steady, though something deeper was already stirring. Something he kept buried beneath layers of ordinary days and mundane repairs. She was walking to school. There was a van. Witnesses said. Sarah's voice dissolved into sobs. The police are here, but they're saying it might be connected to David's work. Some kind of leverage against the pharmaceutical company. Frank's son-in-law worked in research and development, the kind of corporate position that seemed safe, predictable, the kind of life Frank had encouraged his daughter to choose, far from the shadows where he'd once lived. "I'm coming," he said, already moving toward the back office where certain items had waited in a locked drawer for 20 years. "Don't talk to anyone else until I get there. No media, no corporate security, just the police." After hanging up, Frank stood in the center of his garage, surrounded by the tools and projects that defined Old Frank's existence. Auto parts catalogs, work schedules, a life so ordinary it was almost invisible. But beneath the workbench, behind a false panel he'd installed years ago, other tools waited. Tools that belonged to a man who had been officially dead since 2003. Colonel Marcus Reed had been one of the military's most effective specialists in counterterrorism and hostage extraction. His operations had been so classified that when the Pentagon needed him to disappear, they'd simply erased him from existence. New identity, new life, new purpose. The transition had been voluntary. Reed had wanted out, wanted to protect his family from the enemies he'd made in the darkness. Now, as Frank pulled out items he'd hoped never to touch again, the transformation began. A satellite phone with encryption capabilities. False identification documents that would pass any scan. Credit cards linked to accounts that existed in bureaucratic blind spots. And in a case that hadn't been opened in 20 years, weapons that had once made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The drive to Sarah's house took 43 minutes. Long enough for Frank to make several encrypted calls to numbers most people assumed were disconnected. Long enough for Old Frank to finish dying and for pieces of Colonel Reed to reassemble themselves. Sarah lived in a suburban neighborhood where the biggest dangers were supposed to be teenagers driving too fast and packages stolen from doorsteps. Police cars now lined the street, their red and blue lights painting the morning with urgency. Detective Linda Martinez met him at the door. She was younger than Frank had expected, with a kind of direct gaze that suggested competence tempered by compassion. "Mr. Morrison? I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." Frank nodded, studying the scene with eyes that cataloged details automatically. Multiple vehicles, coordinated response, but also confusion. Local law enforcement dealing with something beyond their usual scope. "What do we know?" he asked.
Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thumbs up, you can help more people hear this story by liking this video. Bell, every week we share unforgettable stories of silent heroes.
The abduction happened at 7:23 a.m. Your granddaughter was walking to school when a dark van pulled up. 2 men, both wearing masks. They knew her name, knew her routine. This wasn't random. Frank's jaw tightened. Professionals. The kind who studied their targets, planned their approaches, left minimal evidence. Witnesses, a few, but their descriptions are vague. The van had temporary plates that traced to a rental company in the city, paid for with cash by someone using false identification. Through the living room window, Frank could see Sarah sitting on the couch, her husband David beside her, both looking devastated and helpless. The sight of his daughter's pain sparked something in his chest that he thought was long dead. "Detective Martinez," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust me. Has anyone suggested this might be more than a simple ransom case?" Her expression shifted slightly. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I know my son-in-law works with sensitive research. Because the timing and execution suggest military-level planning. And because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because I have some experience with situations like this." Martinez studied him more closely. "What kind of experience?" "The kind that might help get Emma back." Before she could respond, Frank's encrypted phone buzzed. The text message contained only coordinates and a time. 2 hours from now. Someone was already moving pieces on the board. "I need to step outside for a moment," Frank said. The call connected on the first ring. "Reed." The voice belonged to General Patricia Vance, one of the few people who knew Marcus Reed had never actually died. "I heard about your granddaughter. I'm sorry." "What do you know, Patricia?" "More than I wish I did. The group that took her isn't random. They're connected to an operation you disrupted in Syria, 2002, the Kashim Network. They've been dormant for years, but intelligence suggests they've been planning something significant." Frank felt ice in his veins. The Kashim Network was eliminated. The leadership was. But networks don't die, Marcus. They evolve. This feels like payback 20 years in the making. "What do they want?" "Unknown, but they've been tracking your family for months. Your daughter, your son-in-law, your granddaughter. They know who you really are." Frank closed his eyes. Decades of careful separation between his old life and new one crumbling in real time. Assets. Limited. This is officially a domestic kidnapping. I can't deploy military resources without congressional approval, which we don't have time for. But, she paused, certain freelance assets might be available. People remember what you did for them. "How long do I have?" "Based on their previous operations, maybe 48 hours before they either make their demands clear or disappear entirely." "Marcus, if you're thinking of going active again, I'm not thinking about it." Frank said, "I'm already gone." After ending the call, Frank returned to the house to find Detective Martinez waiting for him with a different expression. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "I just received a call from the FBI. They're taking over the case. They're sending a team from the Counterterrorism Division." Frank felt the last vestiges of his cover identity slipping away when "They'll be here in 3 hours. Until then, we're supposed to maintain the scene and wait for their arrival." 3 hours. It might as well have been 3 days. Every minute Emma remained missing decreased the chances of bringing her home safely. "Detective, I need to ask you to trust me about something that's going to sound impossible." Martinez crossed her arms. "I'm listening." "The man you've been talking to, Frank Morrison, is a mechanic who fixes cars and lives quietly in a small town. But Frank Morrison isn't my real name, and I haven't always been a mechanic. The people who took Emma know who I really am, and they're counting on me being too old, too comfortable, or too scared to do anything about it." She studied his face, clearly trying to determine if she was dealing with a grieving grandfather having a breakdown or something else entirely. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm probably the only person within 100 miles who has the skills and experience to get Emma back alive. But I need you to give me time to work before the FBI arrives and turns this into a bureaucratic nightmare." Martinez was quiet for a long moment. "What kind of skills?" Instead of answering, Frank opened his phone and showed her a message that had just arrived. It was a photo of Emma, sitting in what appeared to be a warehouse, unharmed but clearly frightened. Below the image was a single line of text. "The Colonel remembers Syria. We remember everything." "Jesus," Martinez whispered. "Who are these people?" "The kind who don't make idle threats. The kind who've been planning this for 20 years. And the kind who made one critical mistake." "What mistake?" Frank's expression hardened, and for the first time, Detective Martinez saw something in his eyes that had nothing to do with fixing cars or living quietly. They assumed Frank Morrison was all that was left of the man they really wanted. The next hour passed in careful preparation. Frank retrieved equipment from his truck, while Martinez ran interference with the other officers. To outside observers, it looked like a grandfather getting some air and a detective doing paperwork. Neither was true that Frank's encrypted phone had received 3 more messages, each containing intelligence that painted a clearer picture. The Casham network had established a temporary base in an abandoned industrial complex about 40 miles outside the city. They had Emma, but they also had something else, a chemist who had been working on David's research team. The connection became clear. David's pharmaceutical company had been developing a compound that, in the wrong hands, could be weaponized. The kidnapping wasn't just about revenge. It was about acquisition. They wanted the research, and they were using Emma as leverage to get IT 11:30 a.m. Frank made his decision. "Detective Martinez," he said, approaching her police cruiser where she sat reviewing case files. "I need to go." "Go where?" "To get my granddaughter back." She looked up from her paperwork. "Mr. Morrison, I can't let you interfere with an ongoing investigation. You're not letting me do anything. In about 10 minutes, you're going to get a call that will require you to respond to a traffic accident about 5 miles from here. It'll be a complicated situation that will take your full attention for at least an hour." Martinez frowned. "There's no traffic accident." "There will be." Frank's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it. Right on schedule. Her radio crackled to life. "Unit 23, we have a multi-vehicle accident on Route 44. Possible injuries. Need immediate response." Martinez stared at him. "How did you?" "Because I still have friends who understand that sometimes the system works better when certain people don't have to follow all the rules." Frank handed her a card with a single phone number. "In 2 hours, call this number. Tell them Frank Morrison sent you and that the package is being delivered. They'll know what it means. And if you don't come back..." Frank was already walking toward his truck. "Then tell Sarah I loved her and that Emma has her grandfather's eyes." The drive to the industrial complex took 38 minutes. Frank used the time to make final preparations, his mind shifting fully into the operational mode that had defined Colonel Reed's existence. The mechanical thinking of Frank Morrison, methodical, careful, predictable, gave way to something sharper, more dangerous. The abandoned complex had been a textile plant before overseas manufacturing had killed American industry. Now it was 6 buildings connected by overgrown parking lots and surrounded by rusted fencing, perfect for someone who needed privacy and multiple escape routes. Frank parked his truck a half-mile away and approached on foot, moving through the tree-line with a silence that would have surprised anyone who knew him as a mechanic. The skills were still there, preserved beneath 20 years of ordinary life, like muscle memory waiting for the right moment to resurface. The first building was empty, but showed signs of recent use. Tire tracks in the dirt. Cigarette butts that hadn't been weathered by rain. In the second building, Frank found what he was looking for: .4 vehicles parked in the loading bay. 2 guards outside, both carrying weapons with the casual competence of professionals. Through a grimy window, Frank could see into the main floor where Emma sat in a chair, watched by a third guard while 2 other men worked at a table covered with electronic equipment. No sign of the chemist from David's company. Either he was being held elsewhere or he was already dead. Frank spent 20 minutes studying the situation, mapping patrol routes, identifying weak points, calculating angles of approach. The part of his mind that had once planned operations in hostile territory took over completely, and for the first time in 20 years, Colonel Reed was fully operational. The first guard went down silently, taken from behind while he lit a cigarette. Frank had approached from the blind spot created by a shipping container, moving with the kind of patience that most people confuse with being slow. The guard was unconscious before he hit the ground. The second guard was more alert, but he was expecting trouble from the perimeter, not from the loading dock, where Frank had entered through a window. By the time he realized someone was behind him, it was too late. Frank took his radio, his weapon in his position, watching the main floor through the same window he'd used for reconnaissance. Emma was still in the chair, but she was no longer crying. She was watching the adults around her with the kind of careful attention that reminded Frank of Sarah at that age. Smart girl. Survivor's instincts. The approach to the main floor required crossing 30 yards of open space. Frank had done similar infiltrations dozens of times, but never when his granddaughter's life was at stake. The emotional weight made every movement feel heavier, every decision more critical. He made it to the doorway without being detected. Through the crack in the door, he could see all three remaining hostiles. The guard watching Emma was the closest. The two men at the table were 15 feet away, focused on their equipment. That Frank's encrypted phone vibrated once. A message from General Vance, FBI en route. 20 minutes. 20 minutes to end this before it became a federal siege situation that could last hours and put Emma at greater risk. Frank opened the door and stepped into the room. Emma, close your eyes and don't open them until I tell you. His granddaughter obeyed immediately, squeezing her eyes shut and lowering her head. The guard watching her turn toward Frank's voice, hand moving toward his weapon. He never reached it. The next 30 seconds happened with the kind of violent efficiency that had made Colonel Reed legendary in certain circles. When it was over, three men lay unconscious on the concrete floor, and Frank was kneeling beside Emma's chair, cutting through the zip ties that held her wrists. "It's okay, sweetheart. It's Grandpa Frank. You can open your eyes now." Emma looked up at him with eyes that were too old for her 8 years. "I knew you would come." "How did you know?" "Because Mommy said you were the strongest man she ever knew, and because you smell like the garage." Frank almost smiled. Even in the middle of a counterterrorism operation, he still smelled like motor oil and metal shavings. Some things never changed. "Are you hurt?" "No. They gave me food and water. They said they were waiting for someone to bring them something important." Frank's expression darkened. "Did they say what?" "Papers. About Daddy's work. They said if someone brought the papers, they would take me home." The research, they were still trying to acquire David's pharmaceutical work. Emma had been bait, not just for revenge, but for a larger operation. That Frank's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. "Reed." The voice was unfamiliar, but spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You have something that belongs to us." "I have my granddaughter. That's all I ever wanted." "The research, Colonel. We know your son-in-law has been working on a compound that could be useful. We want the data." Frank looked at Emma, who was listening to every word with the intensity of someone who understood that her life depended on this conversation. "And if I refuse, then this ends badly for everyone. We have the chemist from the pharmaceutical company. We have detailed intelligence on your family's daily routines. We have resources you can't imagine. This doesn't end with just your granddaughter." Frank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 20 years of careful separation collapsing around him. "What do you want me to do?" "Your son-in-law will provide us with the complete research data. In exchange, everyone goes home safely. You have 1 hour. The line went dead. Frank looked at Emma, who was still watching him with those two old eyes. "Grandpa, are the bad men going to hurt Mommy and Daddy?" "No, sweetheart. I won't let that happen." But even as he said it, Frank knew the truth. The Casham Network had no intention of letting anyone go home safely. They had spent 20 years planning this operation, and they wouldn't leave loose ends, which meant Frank had to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. Frank's encrypted phone had one more number in it, a contact he'd hoped never to use again. The call connected immediately. Marcus. The voice belonged to someone who had once been his closest partner in the darkest operations the military had ever conducted. "I wonder when you'd call." "I need a favor, Sam." "I know. I've been tracking the situation. The Casham Network thinks they're playing a game they understand, but they've made a fundamental error." "What error?" "They assumed Colonel Reed was the most dangerous thing they had to worry about. They never considered what happens when a grandfather gets angry." Frank felt something settle in his chest. "How fast can you move?" "I'm already moving. Your son-in-law's research facility is about to experience a very thorough security audit, the kind that identifies and neutralizes foreign intelligence assets, the kind that makes certain pharmaceutical research disappear into classified databases where it can never be used to hurt people. And the chemist, already extracted, he's safe. The Casham Network has been operating under false intelligence for the past 6 hours. Frank felt the first moment of relief since the phone call that started this nightmare. How long have you been watching? Since the moment Emma was taken. Did you really think we'd let you handle this alone? Through the window, Frank could see vehicles approaching the complex. Not FBI vehicles. Military vehicles with no markings and no unit identification. Sam, I need you to understand something. After today, Frank Morrison goes back to fixing cars and living quietly. Colonel Reed died for real this time. I know, Marcus. That's why we're here. To make sure you get that choice. The next hour passed with the kind of precision that Frank remembered from his operational days. The Casham Network's remaining assets were identified and neutralized. The chemist was returned to his family. The research data was secured and classified at a level that would make it impossible to weaponize, and Emma Morrison went home to her parents, carrying only the memory of a scary adventure that ended with her grandfather rescuing her. Detective Martinez never got the full story. The FBI team that arrived found a kidnapping case that had been resolved through excellent police work and fortunate timing. Emma's statement mentioned that the bad men had been confused and arguing among themselves before they decided to let her go. The official report mentioned Frank Morrison as a concerned grandfather who had provided valuable information about his granddaughter's routine. There was no mention of Colonel Reed, no reference to classified operations, no indication that anything more than standard police work had resolved the situation. 3 days later, Frank was back in his garage, hands covered in motor oil, working on the transmission he'd been repairing when the nightmare began. The tools in the hidden compartment had been returned to their darkness. The phone numbers had been disconnected. The man who had moved through an industrial complex like a ghost had been buried again beneath the routine of ordinary life. But something had changed. When Emma visited that weekend, she sat in the corner of the garage and watched him work with the same careful attention she'd shown during her captivity. She didn't ask questions about what had happened. She didn't mention the men who had taken her or the warehouse where she'd been held. Instead, she said, "Grandpa Frank, will you teach me about cars?" Frank looked up from his work, seeing in her eyes the same strength that had helped her survive her ordeal. "Why do you want to learn about cars?" "Because I want to know how to fix things that are broken." Frank smiled, understanding that his granddaughter was asking about more than automotive repair. "Okay, sweetheart, but we'll start with the basics. Some things are more complicated than they look." "That's okay, Grandpa. I'm good at paying attention." As Frank began explaining the function of a transmission, teaching Emma about gears and synchronizers and the delicate balance required to make complex machinery work smoothly, he realized that some lessons were worth passing on. Not the dark skills of Colonel Reed, but the patience and precision that allowed broken things to be made whole again. Outside, the world continued its ordinary business. Cars needed repair. People went to work. Children walked to school safely. The quiet life Frank had built around himself remained intact, protected by the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who choose to appear harmless. And in a small garage that smelled of motor oil and metal shavings, a grandfather taught his granddaughter that the most important skill anyone can learn is how to fix what's broken, whether it's a transmission, a family, or the faith that tomorrow will be better than today. The phone call that had shattered Frank's world at 3:47 a.m. had lasted 3 minutes and 47 seconds. The operation that followed had taken less than 6 hours. But the man who had emerged from that darkness was different from the one who had entered it. Frank Morrison was still a mechanic. But now he was also a grandfather who had proven that some things are worth any sacrifice, any risk, any price. Emma learned quickly. Within a month, she could identify most of the tools in the garage and explain what they were used for. She approached each lesson with the same careful attention she'd shown during her captivity. And Frank found himself teaching her not just about cars, but about patience, precision, and the satisfaction that comes from solving problems through careful analysis and steady hands. Sometimes, late at night when the garage was quiet and Emma had gone home to her parents, Frank would remember the weight of a weapon in his hands and the feeling of moving through hostile territory. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who had been necessary for a brief moment but was no longer required. The man who remained was exactly who he had always been underneath the legends and classifications. A protector, a teacher, a grandfather who would do anything to keep his family safe. And in the morning, When Emma returned to the garage with her notebook and her endless questions about how things worked, Frank would show her something new about the delicate, art of making broken things whole again. Some missions end with medals and ceremonies. Others end with oil-stained hands and a child's laughter echoing through a quiet garage. Frank Morrison had learned that the second kind of ending was worth any price, any sacrifice, any risk. Colonel Reed was dead, but the man who had taken his place was more alive than he'd been in 20 years.